So I think that it's going to be great to be able to talk about all the different experiences that the panelists have had. And then finally joining us as well is Heinrich Deters, and he is the real estate, open space, and trails manager for the city of Park City. He's been there through numerous open space bonds, and he gets to see what happens on the other end of these lands protected, what it means for the city, what it means for some of the landowners that the city works with. And one of the other things that I think is great about the panel, and the reason that I felt it would be valuable to have them all assembled, is they actually represent different kinds of open space bonds, some that are focused more on conservation, easement acquisition, and landowners, and some that are more focused on recreation and general open space that the city ends up acquiring. And I think that it's important to understand that one of the things we are realizing as a state, looking at our other counterpart states, is that different federal sources of funding that require matches really rely on whether or not we as a state have some funding for it. So when you've got local funding through an open space bond, you can actually leverage your dollars and take advantage of some of those federal dollars, as well as private foundations and private donors that might be interested in a particular project. So that's some of the things that we're going to cover through the panel discussion. I'm going to try and keep us on task and on time. And so what I thought I would start out with is just to have each one of the panelists describe the different open space bonds that they've been involved in. And so I thought maybe we'd start with Celeste, then go to Heinrich, and then end with Andy, and then we'll move on to our next question. But Celeste, if you want to go ahead and unmute and talk about the bond that you've been involved in with Midway City, just give us a brief overview.
Yeah, our bond is actually a pretty small one. It was $5 million. And it's the running joke when we were trying to educate people about an open space bond and what we were trying to do. The running joke was, what are you going to do with $5 million? Save a few driveways. We have been able to leverage that money pretty dramatically. And we have saved almost 300 acres. And it has been so successful that our community, including folks who initially voted no the first time, when they've been able to see what we can do and the farms that have been saved, we've got folks talking to us and are very anxious to get another open space bond on the ballot.
Great. Heinrich, you want to jump in?
Yeah, Wendy, thanks. Park City's passed 5 open space bonds in the amount of just over 110 million. The first one was in 1998, and the first few 10 million, 10 million, 20 million really were sort of general obligation bonds to sort of temper some of the development and buy a lot of the Round Valley open space, if you're familiar with that in Park City. So they weren't property specific. Our last 2 that we worked on, Bonanza Flat, Wendy, what you said, property specific. I think, Andy's got a lot of details on that one. And then Treasure Hill, our last one. So, I think the important component of it, numerous times we've been able to leverage that, Wendy, with you numerous times. In your organization, and the approval rating on those bonds has been in the high 70s. I think it's 79 point something, but it's definitely something that the community got behind in the late 90s, and we've always been very thankful that they've passed those bonds with a high percentage rating or approval rating.
And Andy, I know you've been involved in a lot of different bonds, but maybe really specifically just highlight moving forward with Bonanza as a bond, because it was the first, I think, that the city did that was place specific.
Yeah, it was. And it was This was an interesting one because Bonanza, we didn't have under contract. We had a backup offer in on that there was a very large developer called Discovery Land Co. that had it under contract. And so we went out to the public and said, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to purchase this property. We're not sure it's going to land in our hands, but we think we have a good shot at it if the money's available. So we asked them to approve a bond that would never be fulfilled if we weren't able to close on the property. And luckily, they approved it. That particular one, I think, was at about a 67% approval. Public was very excited about it. And we were very excited shortly after the bond was approved for the first deal to fall through and us be able to exercise our backup option and complete the purchase after a whole lot of fundraising done by Utah Open Lands and a lot of our partners.
And I think that leads us kind of into the next question. And I know, Celeste, you're kind of wrestling with this in your community right now, but maybe starting out with Andy and Heinrich, what do you think were some of the differences between having sort of a place-based, this is the open space that we're going after, Treasure Hill, Bonanza Flat, versus kind of the open-ended, we're not really sure which open spaces we're going to be able to acquire. Did you see some marked differences? And I think along those lines, do you think that it affected your power to negotiate basic open space preservation? And then maybe we come to you, Celeste, to talk about what you're thinking about and whether you're going to target some things if you look at another bond. But why don't you start out, Andy and Heinrich? One of you want to comment on that?
Go ahead, Heinrich, you can start.
Well, I mean, I think in its infancy back in the late 90s, I mean, Wendy, you were there after Willow Ranch. You saw a lot of that in the beginning. For communities that are just starting, obviously everything new is a little bit nerve-wracking, right? Celeste, you just went through it, right? And there's a lot of, at some point the community understands, wow, if we don't do something, we're going to be in a world of hurt, right? So, and I think Park City got there pretty early. And so, it was this open space bond that was just, there, but there were so many properties, there was so much to save that I didn't think that it was, it needed to be specific. Actually, as the community sort of matured with that and they realized the importance and it was a tool in the toolbox, when Treasure Hill came up from development pressure or some of the aspects and how important Bonanza Flat was, I don't think it was that different that they identified the property in the bond to go for it. It might have hurt us a little bit in negotiations possibly or something, but the will of the community, I think, spoke pretty clearly through the approval ratings.
Well, and Andy, maybe if you could comment on your perception of whether it affected you, what you were looking at in terms of negotiation. But also, I think when you did Bonanza Flat and Treasure Hill, those were some of the bigger bonds in terms of dollar value. And do you think that at all played a factor in it?
I think those were easier to pass because they were parcels of land that the public was familiar with, that the public recreated on, loved, and to be honest, they were under heavy development threats, and they were for projects that people weren't excited about. So Treasure in particular, for 30 years, our community grappled with that. Shortly after it was approved, I think we realized we bit off more than we can chew. And that's a prominent hillside for those of you who aren't familiar with it. It's a very prominent hillside that the resort's on right above Old Town. And we had an approval to put essentially 1 million square feet of commercial on there, which is about rival to what's on Main Street. So it was just going to loom over the town, and the town was pretty upset about that. And I think we saw that when there was a vote for the bond, that was almost 79% approval. And it's really hard to get 79% of a community to vote to heavily tax themselves on something. They really treasured that piece of land. So it's not completely necessary, but it is another tool to convince folks. And I think how you use your open space is important too. In Park City, the very first open space purchase we did is the White Barn as you drive into town, which is very iconic, and it creates this sort of green barrier and a look and a feel as you come into town. And that set the tone. And people realize that if these places aren't protected, they're going to become malls. And instead, they're treasured places to ride your bikes and walk with your kids and watch wildlife, which is really appreciated.
And that is such an interesting element of how the Park City bonds have really kind of moved forward, within community and some of the community values. And Celeste, your first bond was actually kind of very different in terms of what the community was looking for and what you've been able to do. It was really more conservation easement focused and landowner focused. Again, it wasn't specific to pieces of property, but talk a little bit about that experience in terms of why you think that the community saw that as a potential good thing.
Yeah, I think initially the open space bond was really perceived as a really great tool for helping us control growth, helping us to have the kind of community in 50 years that we wanted it to be. And I think initially that was really the impetus towards it being passed. I believe in our bond, it was a 63% approval. And interestingly enough, in Midway, Wasatch County was also passing an open space bond. And these were both brand new bonds in this area. So this was a new concept. This was new all the way around. And their bond was $10 million. And the concern was we're being overtaxed, et cetera, et cetera. And then what we ended up saving, an iconic dairy. We had a landowner basically just come forward and say, look, if you guys are really serious about this, I've been hanging on to some land for a long time. And he was a developer by profession. But he could see that this mattered in our community. And when his property was presented to the city council, and the community came out in mass to speak in favor of that, and it was approved, he stood up. He was at the meeting and he stood up and he said, listen, the $1 million that was going to go towards this conservation easement, if you guys will promise to give, to put trails around this and to continue to farm the interior of it, I'll give the $1 million back to you. So, I mean, those are the kind of success stories that we had. And another project was a little bit of a hybrid. There's going to be some development on some part of it, but the part that is the view corridor and is what you see when you drive through town is what's going to be saved. So our community has seen that they went into it kind of blind, didn't know what a bond really was going to do, didn't know what we were going to be able to protect, didn't know how this was going to play out. And what we saved is agricultural land that's very important to the community.
That's great. I think maybe it'd be helpful to get into some nuts and bolts in terms of how open space bonds work. And maybe each of you could take a portion of what is the role of the city or the county government in terms of the bond, maybe talk about that bonding process. And then maybe one of I don't know who wants to take that first one, but a follow-up question to that would be, how does the public become informed? And then I'm going to hand that one to Heinrich, and then maybe Andy, if you can follow up at the end. So maybe Celeste, you take the first one. What is the role of the government? Kind of talk about, Andy, can the county or the city advocate for a bond? Talk about the for and against letters, those sorts of things. But Celeste, why don't we start with what does kind of that bond process look like for a city or a county?
Yeah, we had to kind of do a deep dive pretty quickly to find out there's timelines and the pro and con language that has to be provided for the ballot. Once the city council approves putting a bond on the ballot, then we can't use city resources to advocate for or against it, right? But we can assist with things like we can participate in town meetings. We can help folks understand, for example, our little $5 million bond on a home that's valued at about $1 million. The property taxes from Midway on that home are $318. And the bond payment on that is $98. Those are annual amounts. Now, obviously, there's other property taxes, there's school taxes, and there's other things on that tax bill, but Midway specific, the bond $98 payment for a whole year, people are seeing, oh, okay, that is not that much. That's a couple dinners out that I might have to give up, right? And so we can help educate people as to what the amount would be and how that would play out on their tax bill. And we answer questions. We're happy, that's completely allowed and completely legal to answer anyone's questions.
And Heinrich, how else have you seen the public get informed with respect to what's happening with the bond, whether it's a specific piece of property or, just in general? What are some of the ways that the public gets informed?
Well, the bonding process, state code sort of dictates how the bonding process, and Andy, maybe you can speak about, the resolutions that have to be passed, the Celeste, you said the pro and con. I know that the city, we send out a voter info or a open space bond pamphlet that outlines everything. I got to tell you, I spent a little bit of time today on the Conserve Utah site. Your partners going out and talking to people in their living rooms and understanding what those are really play a huge role. I looked at the list of projects there for Conserve Utah. If I'm saying that right, if I apologize if I'm getting that wrong, but the Bridal Veil Falls, some of the canyons there, Utah Lake. I mean, it's really a lot of the stakeholders, whether they're nonprofits for recreation or open space, even some of the the stores in town that they're up in Park City. It's a lot of, we're a resort community. So a lot of the stores, the bike shops and things like that, understand the importance of those. And there's almost like a buzz around town that, hey, look, we have this opportunity to maybe protect this property like Bonanza Flat, but really your stakeholders are a huge, way to get the word out.
And Andy, I know that Heinrich asked you to talk a little bit about kind of some of the legal machinations of it, but I think also maybe hit on the bond language and how you guys have looked at specifically crafting your bond language as you go out, because that becomes a really critical element at the end of the day.
Before I do, Wendy, I'd like to mention one thing that I think is important in this whole process, which is each time we've done a bond, Park City has created a citizen committee, which is comprised of a variety of folks that represent the ag side of things, the development side of things, environmentalists. You got an elected official or two, you've got some business people, and that committee reviews the open space purchases and makes recommendations to the council. And so you end up with about 10 highly respected citizens that are very educated on these issues and very committed to these issues. And they sort of become your ground soldiers, so to speak, when you're advocating for these things and educating the public. They get out there and they help you. And when you're gearing up to do a bond, it is fair game ahead of time to talk about why it's important. Use your role to say the reason we're putting this on the ballot is because we think it has these positive impacts on our community. And even once you hit August and you determine it's going to be on the ballot, you can no longer use city resources, but you can still work with your partners and be there for informational purposes. I know Wendy on Bonanza and also on the Treasure and Armstrong Snow Creek Pastures, Utah Open Lands was holding grassroots house parties. I came to many of those to help explain the details of the bond and put people at ease. And then we also in our town, there's so much enthusiasm over Bonanza. Our leadership class took it on as a project and they decided to help educate the public. So it really can become a community effort where you get these people out there that are your ambassadors, so to speak, that are promoting this and all the benefits from different angles.
That's great. And I think I want to come back to some of the things you talked about with respect to kind of the ranking criteria that you guys all end up using and the citizen committees, because I think across the board, Midway, Park City, and many other communities that have passed bonds, they do rely on a citizen committee to help with kind of a ranking process as these different conservation easements or open spaces come through. But before we turn to that, I was wondering if you guys could speak to the role of conservation easements. Obviously, as a land trust organization, Utah Open Lands is a little bit biased towards the value and the tool of a conservation easement. I see you're laughing, Heinrich. That's great. but maybe speak from your perspective, and obviously there are some pros and cons. Maybe I'll jump to you first, Celeste, because your bond primarily focuses on acquiring conservation easements as opposed to acquiring the fee title. So we'll start there, and then we'll follow up with Heinrich's laughter after that.
And I have to apologize. My public works guy was texting me with an issue in the snow plowing. So what you would like me to speak to is
No problem. So just maybe the role of conservation easements. Why has the city decided that that was the route you wanted to take? Because really the bond has paid for the purchase of conservation easements. So the farmers and ranchers continue to own their land.
Yeah.
But what was some of the thinking behind that, even with that individual that donated the fee title of the property? At the end of the day, there was also a conservation easement component. So maybe speak from your perspective of, what does that mean for the landowner, and why, from a community perspective, did you find that of value?
Yeah, as we discussed it, and again, we're the babies in this is in terms of timing, and we're still pretty new at it, but it appeared to us that it made sense to have conservation easements so that the city wasn't in charge of taking care of some properties, right? Having conservation easements meant that farmers could continue to farm, and that's really become the objective for us. As we're getting into this, that's what we're finding out farmers need. They want to keep their land. They want to keep farming. Their kids want to keep farming. It's generational. It's not something that's going to go away. I think that's a misnomer. The kids want to keep farming the land, and they can't afford to without an influx of some cash, and a conservation easement gives them that. So with the property that ended up being donated to the city fee title outright, we chose to put a conservation easement on that so that a city council down the road can't decide, hey, let's sell this. We really don't need this conservation easement anymore. We wanted to put belt and suspenders on that, keeping that agricultural land. And it's worked so well for us that's what we're going to continue doing.
And Heinrich, you were smiling and laughing a little bit. Maybe you can talk about the pros or the cons that you see with respect to the conservation easement. How have you guys gone about it?
Well, I think we've got about 25 now. I counted, I had to do a website the other day and I counted them up. I think we're up to 25. Celeste touched base on, there's going to be certain times where, right, I'm not a farmer. We want to preserve agricultural property, right? It makes sense for the conservation easement. Obviously, there's tax benefits to that landowner. It's of a lower value than paying fee for it. So there's a lot of just sort of advantages there. But Celeste also touched base on, someone told me a long time ago, and it might have been you, Wendy, there's always a next great idea, and councils and government turnover, and staff like myself, turnover. I think I'm 15, 17 years or so, but it does turn over, and you forget the intent and you forget the relationships and stuff. And the third party, I think, adds, a lot of confidence in a nation that has maybe not so much confidence in government right now. Keeping the annual monitoring, the third party working with, Wendy, how many volunteer days have we had where we have different groups up, and it keeps sort of that, community awareness and partnership and, confidence in the entire open space sort of movement. That's why I think we've done 5, and we've been successful with 5 because we haven't messed up. And a lot of that is because we've put conservation easements on a lot of the properties, and we have great partners. So all good.
Wow, no cons. Okay, Andy.
I'm personally a huge fan of conservation easements, and I think they're important. When you purchase a property, you make a promise to the community about what you're going to do. When you use open space money, you make a promise to the property owner that often the legacy and the relationship is super important, and you do it with intent, and that intent is to live within your footprint. And I often heard from, there were certain city staff and city attorneys and folks that really don't want you to tie your hands with legal agreements with third parties because it can complicate things. But that complication is intentional. You have to be very careful when you purchase land and you put conservation easement on it, that is your intent. And if that is your intent, you don't want future councils to come along and undo that and break all the promises and commitments you made to the parties. And so what I recommend is we started to realize that there are important pieces of land to preserve for whether it's viewshed or recreation or ecological purposes. But sometimes there are also other parcels on the edge of those that may be good for housing or maybe good for a public works need or something. So we as sort of open space 3.0 for us, as we figured out how the funding is appropriate and how the parsing out of these properties is appropriate, that maybe we can carve off pieces that don't need to be preserved for sort of the endless community needs while preserving the critical ones. And you can be nuanced on that, but it's important you be honest and you really codify that in a conservation easement up front.
Right. I think that one of the things I know just from a land trust perspective, as Heinrich has mentioned, getting some of the nonprofit partners involved, there are commitments and there are promises that get made to donors. So that does become a component, I think, when you have the leveraging that can occur with some of these open space bonds. But to that end, maybe each of you could talk a little bit about the leveraging that has been able to happen through some of the open space bonds. And so, Celeste, I'm going to start with you again to maybe talk about the leveraging that you feel has happened in your community. Obviously there are examples like the Albert Kohler Dairy Project. Heinrich, you might talk about the leveraging that occurred from the Armstrong Snow Range pastures and the barn. And then Andy, maybe you could round us out talking about the intense campaign to raise the additional funds for Bonanza. So Celeste, let's start with you.
Yeah, with the dairy here, it's technically in the county, but it's on Midway's boundary, and Midway was pretty specific in the. I love that you guys are 3.0. We're like 0.5 with this first round, but what we made some very specific language when we passed this bond, our bond language, and that the property had to be within Midway or Midway's annexation boundary, because two of our council members in particular really felt strongly that the money that was being accumulated from Midway residents should be used in Midway. And one of the reasons, and the dairy is in our annexation boundary, so it counted. But one of the reasons it became so appealing was the high level of leveraging. So Lee Ray McAllister funding was involved. There was the NRCS, so many acronyms in the government world. There was private funding, and the family was so passionate about that. They really contributed a lot on their side. They left a lot of money, especially if you compare it with what they could have gotten from a developer. So I have to include that in the leveraging component. And Midway, we put up I believe it was $1 million. Wendy, you correct me if I get any of this wrong, but it was easily a $10 million project. So for us, that's a 1 to 10. And we had hoped that we could leverage at least up to 3 times. So all of our projects, the leveraging has been expansive because of the type of projects they were.
Heinrich, why don't you take us through?
I got to just, before I leave that all together, we couldn't have done that without the expertise of Utah Open Lands. I have to say, when you're brand new into this, you don't know what you're doing, and Utah Open Lands does. So kudos.
Well, thanks. Appreciate
Celeste,
that.
I'm gonna follow you and ask the same thing, because Wendy, if I get any of these numbers wrong, you'll let me know. A lot of these, probably my favorite thing about my job is actually getting to know or continuing to know, the old ranching families, that the families that have been there, since the dawn of time. I like to say the Armstrong family is one, in Park City, and it has really just been a leverage, with that entire family. I think we did the first Armstrong about 135 acres, Wendy, and this is where I'm going to need you to right. That was, I think, 5 million we did on that. It was a big piece of property. To be honest, it would have been an absolutely fantastic for all the ski people, another base for Vail Resort. I'm not saying that, right? But I mean, the location that it was, it could have been another base. There was a lot of development pressure. So, I think we got that for a song, and there was a lot of, that family definitely provided a lot of donation in that value. We did, then later on, we did Snow Ranch Pastures, which I recall was much more expensive. There was like a 6 million. They donated 3 million. I'm going to get this wrong, Wendy, but you're nodding your head, right? There was a lot of value. There was a lot of donations that came in, but probably more importantly, right smack dab in the middle of those properties, this beautiful red iconic barn. It's about 11 acres that's on in the homestead. It's absolutely fantastic piece of property, which was donated, as I recall, a conservation easement on that. And Wendy, right? I got that, and you hold that aspect. So again, like the $1 million Celeste, the gentleman standing up, you build these relationships with these great families, and they see how important it is, and the legacy associated, and there's a lot of aspects. And just real quick, Wendy, maybe one you weren't thinking of, as the manager of the property going on, we have been extremely successful getting, whether there's trailhead grants or trail grants, or, the opportunities for getting grants for ecological restoration projects and stuff. When communities or boards that provide grants see that you can serve to this, with bond money and through a community effort with donations, it all builds on itself, and you can really leverage a lot of money in future grants on the properties.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was a 3.3 million that the city put into Armstrong Snow Ranch Pastures. 2.7 million was donated, was brought by community members, foundations, and then I think there was another $6 million at least contribution from the family. So
thank you. I knew I got those a little bit wrong, but thank
all
you.
Good. It's all good. And Andy, I think one of the largest fundraising kind of conservation efforts really that was taken on, I think, to date in the state of Utah really revolved around Bonanza Flat. And maybe you could talk a little bit about what took place there between the bond and then, the additional and the gap, and how that all came together.
Yeah, Wendy, you and I spent a lot of time together on that one. For those that aren't familiar with Bonanza Flat, it's neither in Park City nor Summit County. It's actually on our boundary, right on the edge of Salt Lake, Summit, and Wasatch County, inside Wasatch County. And it's a key watershed for much of the Salt Lake Valley. And so it's a very important piece of land, and Park City certainly wanted to preserve it, but we also felt like it wasn't just ours to preserve, that it's a community treasure, and we wanted to see participation in that. And so Wendy and myself and a few others went on the road and spoke with Salt Lake City, Salt Lake County, Sandy, Metro Water, Midway, Wasatch County, I believe, Heber City. Talked to many of the entities impacted, and they all contributed in different ways, in different amounts, what felt appropriate to them. But it took a lot of education about the importance of the watershed up there, how valued the recreation and ecosystem is. And we definitely could not have done that without a land trust like Utah Open Lands that's a trusted partner there, helping foster those relationships and setting up those meetings and getting us the opportunity. And I will say, when you want to make an open space purchase, if you, as a city or a governmental entity, try to do it by yourself, pretty much you're not going to leverage anything. You're just going to pay what the price is, and if you're lucky, there's a relationship there that you can maybe get a decent value. But my experience has been whenever a land trust takes lead on the negotiations, they are going to leverage both the fact they're a nonprofit and their relationships and their donor base and things to make it a much better overall deal for all parties involved. It's their expertise.
And I couldn't agree more. But also I appreciate the kudos for Utah Open Lands. But I think it is, in that effort, there were 11 different nonprofits that we coalesced together. Because those partnerships are important. And I think beyond the cities and the counties that contributed to it, there were also 3,500 individuals that contributed. And some of it was, $10, some of it was $300,000, but it was all based on, the insurance of protecting the resource. And I think also part of that education that Andy, you spoke of with respect to helping folks realize this does affect the watershed. This affects the canyons. This affects places that we really enjoy playing, that if they're not protected, they go away. I think that the next thing I want to kind of focus in here on the few minutes that we have left is, Andy, you brought up earlier having this citizen committee that you put together to really look and evaluate the various different projects, because there's going to be interest from various different landowners, especially if it's just a general open space. But even with respect to Bonanza, putting together a group of stakeholders that could help with looking at how you wanted to craft the conservation easement moving forward. What would really, I think, be beneficial for folks is to hear kind of how did each of you come up with your ranking process or your criteria? Were there specifics? Were there a percentage of donation that landowners might make that made a specific project potentially rise to the top? Did it have to have certain conservation values, certain recreation values, certain farming values? Did it have to be on the entry corridor? Or what were some of the things that went into that ranking criteria? And Heinrich, you nodded your head first, so we're going to start with you.
Yeah, I'm honestly, Wendy, I think you were in the room when we did ours. We spent I bet we spent 8 months working on our most recent one with COSAC. Now that's been a few years ago, but development pressure obviously ranks high, augmenting existing open space, the ecological values, the recreational components. I think, again, on the website for Conserve Utah, I saw that the Bonneville Shoreline Trail, I know that there's a lot of effort being put into sort of protecting property or aspects like that. And so there were numerous criteria that went through it. There were different conservation easements that we considered, and then even uses. This is when we're looking at properties, passive or active recreation, certain aspects. But I think, and happy to share, I think a lot of that for anybody interested on some of the things. But I think what's been interesting over the years that I've done it is, you go through these processes. It's very important. You rank them, you look at the qualities, you make the recommendations to council, but your number one might not always happen. Sometimes, when you're doing open space, you never know who walks in the door. So you have to be nimble. And when you have those bond dollars that are there, sometimes, you can leverage and you can preserve property, in a very efficient manner. Because opportunities like this, sometimes you just never see them coming, and they might be ranked 7th on your list, but they turn into a great piece of property that further augments other open space and leads you to another path. So, it's having that ranking system is important, but it's you got to keep talking to the community and keep the door open to meet with landowners for opportunities like that.
And Celeste, how has it been kind of going through the ranking process? You've got a Midway Open Space Advisory Committee, very similar to some of the things that Andy and Heinrich talked about. But what are some of the things that that committee has been looking at when they go through their ranking of the different properties to provide some fairness in the process?
Yeah, and I just really want to underscore what Heinrich said. This is not an easy thing to do. It took this committee months and months and months, hours and hours and hours. We tried to even come up with a definition of open space. You know, it's very difficult. And so they came up with a process that has worked incredibly well with us. And like Heinrich, I am happy to share any of these forms or anything with anyone who's interested. But you know, we have a notice of intent. So a landowner comes in and says, you know, we want to become a part of this. And there's some basic information that they have to respond to. And that gives this committee a chance to find out, you know, how close is it to being developed, or is it a view corridor or an agricultural parcel of land, and those kinds of, you know. And what's interesting is we wanted to do this based on what it was the community wanted, but we couldn't get a cohesive definition of what that was. So so we had to just say, okay, all of these are viable. And then what became, in terms of ranking, what became important ultimately for us was, okay, they filled out this paperwork. The committee has looked at the property. We've looked in, you know, we find out, first of all, if they're, you know, working with a conservation group, because that's very important. We don't have the expertise and man hours. And if this landowner is unwilling to work with a conservation group, that's going to put them on a back burner for our committee. But ultimately what really mattered was, okay, these guys are serious. They are continuing to move forward. They are aggressive. And let's face it, everything in Midway is under threat of development. So everyone ranks the same place on that one. And so we just, you know, they're moving forward. They're serious. So we're moving forward and we're serious. Those initial forms are incredibly helpful. I think they're incredibly helpful for our committee as well as the landowner. The landowner can then see, oh, my land is going to be a priority because it has these things, or I can't check any of these boxes. So I may have to reconsider what it is I'm asking for. And my open space committee was very much involved in getting the bond on the ballot, and then they were very much involved in the process and making the recommendations to city council on which projects to move forward with. And so, by the way, they've got a ton of lawyers on that committee, and it still worked. So there you go.
So leaping from that, maybe kind of round us out here, Andy, because I think we've got a couple of minutes left. So talk a little bit about the process, for example, with Kozak and how they would make recommendations to the city council, and how you saw that as a council member and then also as a mayor in terms of what that did for you as a council.
Well, we deeply valued their input, and I think we almost always followed it. What I will say, I think that ranking exercise is absolutely critical for the committee to spend those months debating the values of open space, better understanding it from everybody's perspective. I think they represent a microcosm of your community, so getting their arms wrapped around what the priorities are key. But at the end of the day, it is just an exercise, and I think a lot of these open space opportunities sort of pop up on us. And I look at our two biggest ones, I think Treasure and Bonanza Flat, and neither one of them were even on the ranking list because we didn't think we were going to get that opportunity. And when it did, you know, each one of them we thought was the opportunity of a lifetime, and they happened to come within 2 years of each other. And then some of the other ones we worked with, like Clark Ranch and I think Snow Creek Pastures, I'm not sure those were top 5 even, but they, you know, there's a lot of timing that comes to this, that relationships will be fostered over years. And when the landowner is ready to sell for whatever reason, you need to be ready to move. And so I think it's important to have that criteria. It's important to share it with your community and understand it, but you also need to be ready to move, understanding that you can't, it won't fall in the order that you ideally set it up. Did I answer your question there, Wendy, though?
Yeah. I mean, I think you definitely did in terms of, the fact that the advisory committee does a lot of the legwork for the city council in terms of looking at that ranking, but that also there's probably, I think I put a finer point on it, and I know I've heard this from so many different communities. Certainly, we don't want to go out and target any individual landowner's piece of property, because everybody has their own private property rights, and they're going to fulfill and do whatever they want to. Some will want to exercise the private property right to preserve their land. Some may want to develop it. So being ready in the event that they're considering possible conservation, as you mentioned, Andy, I think is really, really important. But I think that other element that you're speaking to is in every community, and Celeste mentioned it as well, there are those standout properties that that if it were lost, it would change the character of the community. It would have an impact. And sometimes it's several properties. Sometimes it's a general area. And so being able to have that kind of distilled through a committee process that can help to advise the council or the commission, whatever it may be, I think is kind of what you guys have found in Park City.